praise the Lord, guys, I'm Shaw Greenhorn. And they were all amazed and glorified God and were filled with fear, saying, We have seen strange things today. Now it came to pass, Jesus went forth, and he saw a certain publican sitting at the receipt of customs named Levi. And he said unto him, Follow me. And he arose and forsook all and followed him. Now Levi made him a great feast in his own house, and there were gathered together a great company of publicans and others that sat down together. The scribes and Pharisees began to murmur against the disciples, saying, Why eat ye and drink with publicans and sinners? So here we see the conclusion of the man that was taken in the bed sick of a palsy, who, when they could not get to where Jesus was because the press was great, they began to go in to the roof and they let him down. And, we just had the debate where he said, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee. And that, sparked his own debate. So this is the finishing up of that. And then now we see the recruitment of Levi, the publican, sitting at the receipt of customs. So at the conclusion of this man taking in the palsy, we see people being filled with, uncertainty, with a great mixture, of emotions. Sometimes, when a situation is so charged or of a certain, identity, that we can see, great fear. We can see, a great, they said there's for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. According to what is done, we see the people, responding, even if they don't have the consciousness to, understand, line upon line, basically item by item, why they are feeling this way, what it means, what's the significance, what's the underlying meaning, what's the underlying, implication, that something that this magnitude, that it can take on a life of its own. We see them being filled with a mixture of fear and apprehension, them glorifying God. At this moment you can understand that they are being pushed beyond what they are used to. They're being pushed beyond anything that they've encountered before. And like I always say, we have the benefit of all these things written, right? We have the benefit to look back, and see these things. They didn't have these things to look back to. So it was kind of like a, figure it out as we go kind of a deal, trusting that they were in a good hands, in Jesus' hands, and in God's hands. And him being the way, truth, and the life, we see that really taking great significance right here, because him being the way, truth, and the life means that there was no one before him that was the way. We had many prophets from the Old Testament, the Ezekiel's, Jeremiah's, Isaiah's, Samuel's, that they all pointed to him. And, their job was really to warn Israel when they were going astray. Or if God had a certain purpose that was coming that he wanted them to do, for them to, let people know what God was asking of them. But most of the time, it was warnings when they were going astray. So now we have, Jesus here. When people are building a new town and it's just, either a wilderness or somewhere deserted and it's, unoccupied and it's just natural habitat, how they have to go in, layer by layer, create, first of all, the road to get there, how they have to, prepare the area to receive, buildings, structures, monuments and landmarks, how they have to, create something from nothing. And there's a lot of, I want to call it bulldozing, right? Where we have to remove things. We have to plow through, rocks. And we have to prepare the foundation. And this takes a lot of work, right? You can look at a completed area and marvel. And it's hard to even picture what it must have looked like before this area was colonized. Before it was made into something, with modern amenities. Whether it be housing, transport, hospitals, libraries, schools, you name it. How it was just nothing there. So Jesus, he's plowing right now through the wilderness. He's plowing through the unknown. Jesus is plowing, through all the things that are untouched. When he said, surely the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers be few. He was keeping this in mind. This, plowing and establishing, and just how much work it's gonna take. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of focus, time, money, energy. It takes willpower to establish these things. And him being the way, truth, and the life, he's creating, something from nothing. And their reaction is the best that they can give. Not understanding all things, not understanding where he's coming from, why he's doing it, not understanding, the greater picture, or even the details, the fine, small details, as only he knows. But, just trust him, because, he's building. So, them having this reaction, he's taking them somewhere they haven't been before. He's showing them things that they haven't seen before, things that have never been attempted before. So, you're going to get a mixture of reactions. You're going to get some that are amazed. You're going to get some that are afraid. People fear change. You're going to get some that want to stay the same, stagnant without growing or moving. You're going to have some that are against it, looking to tear down, looking to oppose. You're going to have some that they look, to just, stand in the way of everything that's going on. Some will see it as a good thing, some will see it as a bad thing. But like I've seen, so many people say that, they hated, certain animals like cats. Like you'll see a wife post on the internet that how her husband, he said he hates cats. But then when she got the cat, he's the cat's best friend, even more than with the wife. It's kind of like that, when they see it being built, they'll fear it, they'll hate it. They'll be unsure, they'll be uneasy. But then when it's established and they see the benefit, and I just goes to show you the difference between potential benefit and actual benefit. Benefit in theory versus actual benefit. Something established. Something calculated and something in theory. Versus something that's been established. The great difference. In these two things. So right now it's in him. Right, it's in his mind. He has the blueprint. And he said that his doctrine is not his, but him that sent him, and he's come to make all these things, to fulfill all these things, just to establish God's kingdom in this earth. So them having this mix of emotions is really in reaction. It's not just the healing of this man, but it's the energy he's walking with. It's the purpose, it's the spirit that he's walking with. No doubt they haven't seen these kind of things before. This being, God in the flesh himself. So we see also the recruitment of Levi, the publican, sitting at the receipt of customs. Now, as I explained in our previous video, the publicans, they were tax collectors. They were Jews, but they were, given authority by the Romans. They had to pay a certain amount to get the position. Then after that, then they would be tax collectors, working for the Romans. And, each man was expected to, collect a certain amount. But what they would often do is, go over this amount, sometimes by a whole lot. Because that's how they made their money. It was from the excess that was left over, after what was required. And, some of them, they got real greedy. They were considered, enemies by the Jews. Of their own people, they were considered enemies. And then traitors is what they were, the word that was used. So we see, Jesus calling him, follow me. How lucky. But at the same time, Jesus, he was establishing his disciples. We just saw, Simon Peter and James and John get called. We didn't see Andrew, even though we know that he was recruited at the same time. But his name wasn't called, individually. Keep this in comparison to, the two people that wanted to be recruited by Jesus, and he told them no. First, the one that said, Master, I will follow thee whithersoever thou goest. Jesus said, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man had not where to lay his head. And the other rich, young disciple, the one that, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, the commandments, thou shalt not kill, steal, bear false witness, commit adultery, love thy neighbor as thyself, all these things. And then he said, I've kept all these things from my youth up. Jesus said, one thing thou lackest, go and sell that thou hast and give to the poor. Then thou shalt have treasure in heaven. And that's when he said, how hardly shall a rich man enter into heaven. So, these two, they wanted to be with him, and they were told no, pretty much. But at the same time, there were others that, they were accepted. The one that said, when Jesus said, follow me, and then he said, suffer me first to go and bury my mother and father. Jesus said, follow me, that the dead bury their dead. So, at this point, he has just 4, and he's, getting the rest. So there's a different, thing going on, because he's building his team. It's, at the point where he would meet these other guys, he had a full house. So he wasn't really looking, as he's looking right now, to establish his disciples. So, they came at a different, energy, a different, the team is already here, and we're not really looking to expand. But, wherever he goes, if you would see somebody like super excellent, somebody that was on their game, in their heart, having the right intentions, not looking for fame or popularity or riches, not looking to be, talked about for the wrong reasons, but, anybody that was with, a pure and genuine heart, somebody that, cared for the people, and, they had principles, about them, and they had reasons as to why they wanted to be on his team, reasons concerning, the kingdom of God, and setting this thing up, the way that it's supposed to be. So we see him, making a bold, move, forsaking all and following him. Now we know that the fame of Jesus had gone throughout the region round about, right? So what's not, explicitly stated or even implied is whether he knew who Jesus was or not. Did he hear of any of the rumors about him? things that he has been doing so far. Because remember, he did pay, and it's a good amount that he had to pay to get this title to be a tax collector, a publican. So no doubt he wouldn't just give that up so easy. And I guess he could always go back to it later if it just didn't work out. But we see him taking a chance here. Sometimes, a lot of things in life, will be like that. Some chances when they present themselves to you, you don't get, a second time to say yes. Depending on what is being asked, depending on the value that you bring. If you're like a LeBron James, in his prime, if you say no, they'll come back again. You can say no a million times and they'll keep coming back. But if you have a lesser name, that one, you might only get one time to say yes or no. So we see him, making a feast for Jesus in his own house. So, the scribes and Pharisees being there, making this observation how he eats, with publicans and sinners. And, they judge, outwardly. They judge so wrongly. They don't see it as, the sheep. Understanding that you have different sheep. Jesus himself even said, I have sheep that are not of this fold, right? Instead of seeing it like, these are all God's children. And at some point, they each to give their own, answer, yes or no, to the kingdom of God. Instead of seeing it as a way to, farm and to recruit, they look down on them and they judge them. But at the same time, they're an extension of, Moses, time and Joshua and the kings and the judges, the prophets, the Old Testament prophets. And, God's people was the children of Israel. He didn't really see them, reaching out, to others like that. So I guess, keeping that in mind, I guess you can understand, where they're coming from. Because it's just been, either you're of Israel or you're not. It was by birth. And Jesus, he was coming here to address certain things. Because there's no way that you guys are gonna be given this thing by birthright, and then as God says, you draw nigh to me with your mouth, but then your heart is so far away. And God, He did create all things and all people, and He's not gonna just leave certain people out just because they're not of a certain lineage or country or nationality identity. But He's come to save all. All right, so how did we get here? Being in the fifth chapter of Luke, if we fast forward to where, this whole thing started, him being in the temple teaching. So it came to pass on a certain day, as he taught, that certain Pharisees and doctors of the law were sitting by, who were come out of every town of Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem. And the Spirit of the Lord was there to heal them. So now it came to pass, men brought in a bed, one taken with a palsy, and when they sought by what means to bring him in before him, that they may lay him before Jesus, when they could not find what way to enter in because of the multitude, that they climbed up on the roof and began to let him down through the tile with his couch into the midst where Jesus was. When Jesus looked up and he saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Man, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee. Now the scribes and Pharisees that were standing nearby, they began reasoning, saying, Who is this that blaspheme? Who can forgive sins but God alone? And when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he said unto them, What reason ye? Whether it's easier to say to the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or arise, take up thy bed and walk, but that thou mightest know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins also. So he said unto the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go to thine house. And immediately he arose before them, took up that whereon he lay, departed to his own house. So then we pick up right here. And they were all amazed and glorified God, and were filled with fear, saying, We have seen strange things today. So now, like I said, this is in, reaction to not only this moment, but, Jesus, he's walking with a certain momentum right now, right? He's walking through, the doors are opening, people getting healed, people hearing his words, them understanding and receiving the true words of God and not the drawn out, worn out, rehearsed, passed on from generation to generation, things that the scribes and Pharisees, the Sadducees, chief priests, elders, that they were teaching. If you were to pay attention, you could understand that, a certain point that, they went off course and it seemed as if there was nothing there to correct them. But if you know how the Spirit of the Lord works, there's always a correction, however small, however great it might be. But there's always a correction. And no doubt they received it the wrong way or they didn't receive it at all. They thought that they knew better. They thought that, all these, misconceptions. And then, just that time over time, they drifted up, apart from where they were supposed to be. Certain appliances, certain inventions, they have to be calibrated every once in a while, or else they go off and they start giving you incorrect readings. Your car, the front end, I don't know if they still do it, but, we used to get alignments, when I was young, family car. Because if not, then steering wheel would be straight, but the wheels would not be straight. And depending on how bad you allowed this to get, you might get completely, off balance. So, they were teaching and they were, evangelizing, they were ministering, unto God's people, but they were not being calibrated by God. Jesus said, teaching for doctrine, the commandments of men. I would ask a question because, the law of Moses, they were, required as children to know these things. They all knew the statutes. They all knew the writings. They knew it. So then, I could ask the question, is it because they knew that everybody knew it that they would then go on to teach these other things? It's like saying, well, you guys already know it. So, why spend so much time, on that, instead of just teaching you new things? Because, they were expected to be experts, on all these, subjects. So, and one thing, to understand also, he just said, thy sins be forgiven thee. And then they started, murmuring, who is this that blasphemeth? And no doubt the people heard him say this also. And, Jesus, he confronted them, wherefore reason ye in your hearts? Which one is easier to say? That sins be forgiven thee, or just take up your bed and walk? It's take up your bed and walk. That's way easier to say. And there's no, deep reasoning, that you have to consider, why is he able to say this? Is he able to say this? That sins forgiven thee. Who is he? That has such authority to say this. And there's many things that you can reason and ask questions, right? But take up that bed and walk is simple. Just take up your bed and go to home. So now him having, established that he has the authority to say this, and then also now to follow through with such a powerful healing. This is a great confirmation that he is who he says that he is. So now the people, they are concluding from this that he does have authority to forgive sins. He's not just speaking because it sounds good. He didn't come up with this on a whim, or trying to present himself as some false Messiah or false teacher, false great one. But he's the real deal, because this man is in this bed. I know that these people, they know the people of the region, right? When blind Bartimaeus was sitting by the wayside begging, they knew that it was blind Bartimaeus. So no doubt they knew who this guy was, even though with his cerebral palsy probably stayed inside. But in towns like these, the people, they know each other, right? Because the parents know each other, so the children, they end up knowing each other also. And life back then was less complicated with the internet and cell phones and social media. Things going viral, people doing all these things. There was less distraction, so they had more time. This is all they had to, to focus on. So they were so amazed, praised God. So seeing him argue with scribes and Pharisees, and you have to understand that they were the religious leaders, right? I always say they were the religious leaders. They had all right to ask him, who gave you authority to be teaching in the temple? We didn't give you authority to be teaching in the temple. Not only that, who gave you the authority, and who gave you the authority to do these miracles? They had a right to be asking him these things. So no, they just witnessed him, argue with these leaders, and he came out on top. First of all, you don't see people arguing with them. Their word is final. Their word is law. At one point when Jesus was getting, famous, and they started hitting him, no man could confess on Jesus, or else he would have been put out the temple. That's how much power they had, when they were trying to silence him. Yeah, the people, they still went, they still received their healing, they still heard him, but they had to keep it quiet, amongst themselves. They couldn't go up publicizing it. They couldn't go up, publicly praising him, and accepting him, outwardly. It was kind of like he was still there, but they had to operate like in an underground kind of mindset, because they would put them out of the synagogue. So they just, saw him argue with them, and then he healed this man. So now one is left to reason that, well, if he's arguing that he can forgive sins and he just healed this man, then he can forgive sins. So now they're amazed, because, this kind of power, we don't see, just walking around, just like that. None of them, I just listed some Old Testament prophets, none of them were able to forgive sins. None of them even tried to say that they were able to forgive sins. If we saw anything be healed, it was, a leprosy, like a handful of people got brought back from the dead. This broad based healing, outward, just consistent, just time after time, this kind of healing, we didn't see it before. And he's given the right signs to match the words that he's saying. So they were all amazed, and glorified God, because this is the answer to their prayers. This is the answer to everything that they've been praying for. This is the answer, and they were filled with fear, saying, we have seen strange things today. So there's too much going on, in energy and spirit to process. And, human beings, we fear what we don't understand. We fear what we can't control. Anything that puts us out of being, the center of the universe, because this is way above their heads. And anything this way above their head, what if it was to turn and change and then have, bad intentions towards them? They would be unable to do anything about it, right? The next one says, and as he went forth, behold, he saw a certain publican named Levi sitting at the receipt of customs. And he said unto him, follow me. So now he's leaving the synagogue, after having, given the right answer and demonstrated, and it seems as if this is also a reason why they start hating him so much, because he just put all of them to shame, right? Even though he didn't intend for it to happen, but they're coming at him head on. And once you open this kind of door, somebody's leaving in shame, right? If you think about it, when a person steps up and challenges the next person, right? If they were just two ships, passing by, everything would have been okay. And if they were just, a normal interaction, then everything would have been okay. But see the moment that one decides to challenge the other, somebody's leaving, in shame. Somebody's leaving with a lesser and somebody's leaving with the upper hand, right? So no, they said, who can forgive, who is this that blasphemous? Who can forgive sins but God? Right? Even though they said it in their heart, he addressed it. So not only did he let the people know that this is what they were thinking, but he addressed it and showed them that he did have all right to be thinking like this. So now he just left, right? So he didn't give them a chance to sit there and defend themselves. He didn't give them a chance to fire back, and then turn the tides and then have him look foolish and them looking like the winners of this argument. So he went out, saw this publican, sitting by the receipt of customs. So, he's on duty, doing his thing. And Jesus said unto him, follow me. So now he has, just fishermen so far. Now here we have a tax collector. God, how he is, how he has people from all walks of life. He has blue collar, white collar. He has athletes, entertainers, singers. He has teachers, doctors, students, the young, the old. Jeremiah was so young, right? When he was called. So was Samuel. He just used Simeon of Jerusalem to bless Jesus. And this man was waiting to see him before he died. He would not die before seeing the Lord Christ. So he said unto him, follow me. So now one can ask the question, why did he, say unto him, follow me? Because no doubt he walked past so many people, right? I would say I have not seen it in any of the Gospels how Judas got recruited or how he came on board. But with this man, no doubt he had a reason why. There was something in him that would, purpose that could be used at a certain point. Maybe his point of view was unique. So the next one says, so he arose and forsook all and followed him. Ask the question, did he know of Jesus, who he was? Did he have the miracles or not? It's not clear. It's not, if he did or not. But as soon as he said, follow me, he arose. So now Jesus, he's walking with, a multitude at this point. And it's very clear that he's the leader. By his body language, his, charisma. Notice that when he stops, everybody stops. When he turns, everybody turns. There's certain nonverbals that makes, us know that he's the leader. And, Levi, he picks up on this, very quickly. So, I imagine what's going through his mind, is that, a man of this power, this powerful, that has this kind of following, he's telling me to follow him. He's calling for me, individually. We know that, all these people that are following him, they just came on, they themselves came and just started following him. We just saw where when the sun was setting, all that had any sick with, diverse diseases brought all them unto him, and he laid his hands on them and healed them. Then when the day was come, how he departed into a wilderness, and the people, they came unto him and stayed him and desired that he would not depart from them. So these people, they are following him at this point. But the difference with this Levi here, he's being called, he's being asked to follow, he's being invited on. So there's a difference between being invited on and just, you taking up yourself to follow. So as soon as he said it, he rose up. So, he knows that something special is going on here. Jesus is the talk of the town, and, he's looking, being a tax collector, how he came on, that's kind of like a mini, entrepreneur, I would say. So now here's a greater entrepreneur, calling him on. And even though he might not be able to verbalize, why, he might not be able to verbalize the spirit, that's in Jesus, the light that's on his life, the energy, the specific, aura that he's, showing. Because remember, whenever these evil spirits saw him, they would fall down saying that thou art Christ, the Son of God. They were seeing something. So he forsook all. What is it to forsake? To forsake is to let go of something. Something that it meant something to you. Think about when people forsake people, and they say, I can't believe, this one, you did that. I can't believe you left me like that. We understand that there was some sort of a bond, going on. These things, they meant something to you. And how could you just turn your back to these things? It's kind of like a betrayal, To forsake something is almost like betraying. So he betrayed everything, for Jesus' sake. You'd be surprised what you mean to somebody when somebody of a higher value comes around and they begin to throw you to the dogs, and you were once important to this person, and then now you have to sit there and play a lesser role. And you can do is ask the question, how could this person just, toss me to the side? How could this person just, betray me? How could this person, just, let me, fall through the crack? I thought that, we had a deeper bond, than this. I thought that there was more going on, that I would mean more to this person. Well, he was doing this, to these things, to his, receipt of customs, job being a tax collector. And it's kind of like putting these things out the door, showing them the door. You can't, stay, but you don't have to go home, but you gotta go. So he forsook all and followed Jesus. Following Jesus means, he's the head. He's in charge. You don't get to come on and cause problems. He's the one that's showing you how these things are going. If anybody before him would have been able to do it, then they would have done it, right? Because there's a thing that happens when you show a person like how to do something. Before you get through showing them the whole thing, they try to take over. Based on what they've already learned, and they think that they know the rest. When they might get it right, but they can also get it wrong, right? So he forsook all and he followed Jesus. I would say the same argument I said earlier about being calibrated by God, that we have. There's a lot that they started out following God, but they went off course. They stopped hearing his voice, and then there's so many things speaking to them, so they went off course and they lost calibration. And now they're doing the best that they can, and you see, because they objectively can't tell that they are not operating on something that they have no business where they should be. Nobody can tell them that, hey, you've gone off course. And that's how we get a lot of ministers saying crazy things like, calling God a she. Ministers saying that if you don't give, $2,000, then you're gonna be cursed. All the other crazy things that they be saying in these, last and evil days, right? So the next one says, now Levi held a great feast for him at his own house, and they were gathered together a great company, publicans and others that sat down together. So Levi, the man of the moment right now, he took Jesus home and he's having a great feast. These tax collectors, like I said, they, were allowed to overcharge, and whatsoever they overcharged, they got to keep the rest. So they had, a lot of motivation to, take excess from the people, and it was frowned upon, but there was nothing that was really done, against it. So he had the means to keep this feast. And we see other publicans there. A person who would usually be friends with the kind of people that, that they themselves are. That's usually the kind of friends that they have. So, he's treating Jesus with honor in this moment. It's kind of like almost like a little birthday party, because no doubt Jesus, he's the guest of honor. And, after all the healings that they have just done, the preaching, now it's time to be, refueled. No doubt the kingdom of God is going forward, because when Jesus, sits down, no doubt they're gonna have questions to ask him, and he's gonna reveal such like he said, secrets that have been kept secret since before the foundation of the world. And he's given insight, he's given wisdom, and when these people hear him, they're becoming followers, they're believing. So even though he's not officially preaching, he's still guiding these people to God. Alright, so the last one says, but the scribes and Pharisees murmured against the disciples, saying, why eat and drink ye with publicans and sinners? So them, it seems as if, no matter what they look at, they're gonna always find fault. If you notice what when they're around, have you ever been around a friend like that? That they can never appreciate the beauty of the moment of what's going on, but they always have some fault to find. They're always complaining about something. It just shows you, what was going on in their hearts. The fruits of the spirit, right? Love, joy, peace, temperance, long suffering, patience, kindness. They didn't have any of these things. They were just, robotic, teachers of doctrine. And the more they taught, it seemed as if they would go down a further and further road of just being more hardened, more robotic. They had lost, the beauty of all life. Here is this man. He just healed this man with the palsy. Where's the first of all, can you be empathic and understand the trouble that this person must have had? They had no life. They probably, this man, he probably could not have a wife, children, a household, and a way to pass on his legacy. How much suffering, was this man feeling? They have time to be upset that he got healed. And now, here they are about to complain. You see, and they think that they're better than everybody else. They think that they got it right, when they got it so wrong. So now they're murmuring. And there's a personality and identity that goes with being a murmurer, a fault finder. These people, they're easy to find and spot, right? So they're murmuring against the disciples. Why are you guys associating with these people? I'm Straw Greenhorn.